When we step into a house, we are, perhaps unconsciously, agreeing to a set of physical rules. We may abide by rules such as following the structure of walls and floors, carrying the peace by agreeing to use doors to enter and exit spaces. We also understand the way a house wishes to guide us by the way it may choose to offer hallways, or perhaps wishes to welcome conversation through shared spaces. Although a house asks us to follow its rules, we inhabitants are the ones who raise a house with a moral compass. We manipulate the form of a house for it to favor us over the outside. This design serves us by, at its core, denying nature free will. We build gutters to deny water the opportunity to bother us. We use drywall to further separate ourselves from the wooden beams that support us. We build large windows and minimal wooden designs to allow us the illusion of being outside, with all the comforts of being inside. But if the house chose to empty its panes of glass, the house is unsafe. What is this power dynamic? Are there times where we as humans are physically shunned by a space because it refuses to attach itself to human existence by favoring the outside? Nature seems to be the most feared element in architecture. In turn, we create homes to control nature rather than allowing nature agency. But what would a house look like that does not try to separate itself from nature, but instead invites it into the design, allowing for the unpredictability of growth and decay? Let me explain what I mean by this power equality. A house can hold power if it shuns a person by being completely unsafe in itself. For example, a house can have mold, structural issues, gas leaks, or perhaps more physically, have a distaste for people, having doors too small to walk through, a lack of windows. There are also spaces that favor for the inhabitants' power over the houses that require upkeep. Perhaps the beams or wooden porches that support the house need to be replaced every few years, depending on an inhabitant to do so. Or maybe this house is willing to brace high winds, deep snow with the most of its might, leaving the inhabitant as the only comfort in its life. But the in-between of these two things is where the answer lies. What is a house that lives inside itself the same way a human inhabitant would? I think back to where I was raised in eastern Kentucky in the Appalachian Mountains. The rolling mountainsides, being the oldest in the world, are covered in brisk brush and medium dense forests. The forests have a very whimsical feeling about them. I have heard people call the area a fairyland because of all the caves and hidden crevices found in the complex brush. Although none have been able to prove their claim of seeing a fairy, what others swear to have seen is rather a fairy's house. There is something more fascinating to me about a fairy's dwelling rather than the actual fairies themselves. Although these houses often have been deduced to mysterious-looking holes in trees or sticks fallen in some particular order, fairy homes are interesting because of the set of rules they abide by that contradict the need for longevity that we rely on in mainstream architecture. This association has me thinking about how fairies consider their relationship with nature in architecture. We shun nature, so it cannot shun us. Fairies accept their smallness in the world and choose to abide by the rules of nature and temporality for their own sake. For example, a fairy may be found living in a tree, a living tree, burrowing inside of it, but still human enough to consider aesthetics and livability of certain materials nearby. Their home might appear something similar to ours. A living tree to us may sound unreasonable, since it opens the possibility for an ecosystem outside our own to dwell in. Fairies teach us how to think like a being of nature, a wild human with a strong sense of the environment. Fairy houses teach us how to balance the power dynamic between a house and inhabitant by incorporating the living world, the materiality of living things. In this project, I sought to dissect these houses and what makes them in tune with their surroundings, focusing on Appalachia and its natural materials. To learn firsthand what rules make up a fairy home, I had to build my own while thinking and seeing nature from a fairy lens, or seeing with the intention of miniature form. I began building my fairy house by foraging materials from around my family's farm in Appalachia. I gathered materials that could theoretically be obtained by a fairy, such as sticks fallen from trees, pine cones, and creek pebbles. The best way to think like a fairy is to surrender yourself away from blueprints and work intuitively with what is around you. Like a bird collecting hay for its nest, I considered how to make something from the landscape, and the landscape something for my house. I gathered an assortment of sticks from oak trees, sweet gums, buckeyes, an apple tree, maple, poplar, and pine. I had a beautiful variety to work with here, and then I searched for other materials that I would come across and creatively imagine a house utilizing. I collected vines, flowers, dried pine needles, moss, acorns, and even sheep wool from the family farm. I found myself working and thinking completely intuitively when designing this house. I found a stick that was thick and twisted and decided it would make an interesting shape as a wall. I came across different seeds and nuts and considered how they can be used as small planters or bumpy roofs, for example. I even found, while walking through the creek one evening, an entire buck skeleton. I removed its skull and then its antlers, which were at perfect size to be used on my small house. After foraging for materials, I thought about what the best way would be to start my building process. This made me consider thinking critically about the local architecture, such as the way early Appalachians would build their cabin. These were actually made from a lot of the same materials that I foraged while looking for things for my cabin, just in larger scale. Right down the road from my family's farm, one of these cabins sits deep in a holler. This cabin is worn down and is now unlivable. Like many others, these cabins were made with no blueprints but intuitively designed, accepting the fact that they may not last even for another generation. These cabins work intuitively with local material in a similar way fairy houses do. So I wanted to pay homage to the materials I found and draw a sense of human intention to this fairy house by researching the way that Appalachian cabins were made. I wanted to think like a fairy, but also as an Appalachian, since that was the source of my materials. I cut sticks down to workable size and secure them together into a cabin formation using dovetail notches commonly used in these Appalachian cabins. I then worked intuitively, deciding how different sized sticks would impact the design of the roof, walls, and window areas. I cut logs down the middle on its side with an axe, which is the way Appalachians would create their shingles. I just had to use smaller lumber for a smaller purpose, which turned out to be very difficult. The cabin was coming together very soundly. I began to include my other foraged items, which is where it got fun. This is where I really let myself work freely, basing my decisions on aesthetics as well as stability. As a final touch, I attached the antlers to the front of the house, accentuating the doorway. After a couple months of foraging material, researching Appalachian cabins, and building intuitively, my fairy cabin was complete. Although this cabin is not perfectly attuned to nature as a tree house might be, it has elements that will continue to change, such as the mossy roof and the untreated wood, which is already changing because, as I found out, there are powder post beetles living inside this cabin. Thanks, Joseph, for the heads up on that one. This cabin serves just as good a purpose as the early Appalachian cabins it pays homage to, through its relatable design, understanding for the region's woods, and just finding that middle ground between landscape, house, and person. The question remains, is it fair to say these houses are equally in tune to nature and inhabitant? As I mentioned at the beginning of this essay, houses utilize rules to create a communication between the relationship of inhabitant and house. Fairy houses complicate what home is through their relationship with the unknown. Because we cannot have complete control of the house, It inherently favors the rules of nature over the rules created by an inhabitant. It is up to the inhabitant to bridge these dynamics and find a space of coordination. This lack of human consideration is not a bad thing, however. We only think a house should be perfectly safe from natural elements because we do not often plan to live in ones that accept this element. Although we are not fairies, this practice can be applied to any structure. Consider the rules of a home, experiment with what is allowed, and be prepared to reposition yourself, an inhabitant, in the background to make way for nature. See what happens and meditate on the way a fairy home can serve you by not abiding by your ego. Let the house escape you, let it rot in time, and let it be reborn. Allow it agency over everything. Why must we enjoy nature by separating ourselves and using our house as an observation tank? Why not make nature a part of the design? To close off this presentation, I have made an animation using this fairy cabin I built to think about the relationship I have built with this house. I want to demonstrate a house's agency by animating the idea of living materiality and a house's perspective of growth. Although I'm not its inhabitant, I can see it doesn't need one, because through this process, I have learned that these houses exist first, the inhabitant second. When a house is uninhabited, nature takes back its place and reclaims its home. Fairy houses live in this in-between realm.